So as you guys likely know, and Ryan and Emily covered very ably yesterday, there was a massive police crackdown across New York City colleges, including at Columbia University. And the next day, Morning Joe, of course, ready to manufacture consent, they brought on the Deputy Commissioner of Police to make some extraordinary claims about some of the tools that these protesters were using at Hamilton Hall, what they named Hins Hall. Let's take a listen.
Tell us about this change.
Yeah, so when we entered Hamilton Hall, this is not what students bring to school. Okay, this is what professionals bring to campuses and universities. These are heavy industrial chains that were locked with bike locks. And this is what we encountered on every door inside of Hamilton Hall. And so in order for our emergency services group to enter into the building, they had to first cut through these chains.
Heavy industrial chains. This, Saagar, is what professionals bring. This isn't what students would have access to, which plays into this whole trope that was being pushed relentlessly on CNN and other places that, oh, it was actually, this isn't even students, this is outside agitators to make this like super extra scary. It didn't take long for people to pull up. This is literally a bike lock that is sold by Columbia University.
At the Columbia University gift shop. Literally the exact same one, which is very likely where they bought it from. It is really hilarious. And it's also one of those where just this morning, Krystal, Mayor Eric Adams actually was asked on MSNBC how many people who were not Columbia University students were arrested. Approximately 300 of the people who were arrested. He's only able to name 2 so far that were there, which is actually far below the average at University of Texas Austin and others, where you actually saw a majority of the people at some of those protests which were arrested, which were not students. But in this particular case, it does seem that the absolute vast majority, 298 out of 300 so far, confirmed to have been students at Columbia University.
Yeah, and I mean, just so you understand why this was like an important propaganda point, and Anderson Cooper was pushing this, the police department was pushing this whole narrative of like, we don't even think this is students, we think this is outside agitators, is because outside agitators sounds like crazy, scary, violent radicals. Whereas college kids, you're like, these are college students who've been camping out, who are engaging in the sort of protest techniques that we've seen, you know, for decades that are sort of tried and true, even if you don't like them or agree with them or disagree with them or whatever. It's a very different valence when you're crafting this narrative about these scary, radical, outside agitators coming in with professional industrial grade chains than college students who have bike locks that they bought at the campus bookstore.
Yeah, it's just totally ridiculous what we've seen from a lot of the NYPD. I will say the outside agitator, like I said, initially I was skeptical but willing to believe some of it because of the UT Austin numbers that had previously come out. The other thing is that Columbia University and the NYPD put together an entire presentation before the raid, somewhere around 8 p.m., where they specifically highlighted students or people who were wearing ski masks and others that were entering the building, specifically saying that these individuals were from outside of the university. And it's like, well, okay. And again, if you'll remember when we were all talking about this live, I said this will be a great claim to check after the arrests have been made, whether they were telling the truth or not. And I think people should also understand this is a key pretext for the launch of the raid on Columbia University. Yes, there was Hamilton Hall being occupied, the property damage and all of that. But the actual pretext, if you look at the letter that was sent by Columbia University to NYPD, very specifically highlights that it claims that were non-students that were inside of the hall.
That's really important. And I also want to point out, because the windows that were broken and the occupation of Hamilton Hall was used as a pretext for this, like, I mean, you saw how many police and riot gear and the heavy artillery and all of this, okay? But it didn't just happen at Columbia University. You know, at City College, which is just up the street about 20 blocks, I actually used to live right there in that neighborhood in northern Manhattan, there were, by all accounts, entirely peaceful protests. As far as I know, there was no even property damage, no buildings occupied or anything. And they still had this overwhelming police crackdown of the sort that we've seen, you know, on campuses across the country. So, and also, obviously, this is not the normal response for broken windows and trespassing. I think we can all see very clearly the reason for the response is because they don't want the dissent. They want to make sure this entire movement is completely crushed. It's all a method of avoiding the conversation about what these students are actually protesting and whether or not their cause is actually just. But we've got more for you from the NYPD. This is Rebecca Weiner, head of the NYPD Counterterrorism Bureau, talking about why this response was necessary. Take a listen.
This is not about students expressing ideas. It is about a change in tactics that presents a concern and a normalization and mainstreaming of rhetoric. And I'm not just talking about language, I'm now talking about tactics. And that's what shifted our response yesterday. But a normalization and mainstreaming of rhetoric associated with terrorism that has now become pretty common on college campuses, right? You see people wearing headbands associated with foreign terrorist organizations. This happened in October when you had a viral TikTok reissuing of Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter to America. So that's a larger concern. It's separate from what happened yesterday, but they're related. We do not want ideas. We do not want campuses, which are where people are supposed to be learning and being in a conducive environment for all of the things that we do in schools, being turned into places where people are committing vandalism, property damage, and committing crimes.
I like the part where she says we don't want ideas. That's very clear. I mean, this is, listen, you can hate their cause, you can hate their speech, you can think that it's, the same thing that a terrorist would, it doesn't matter. There is no carve out in the First Amendment for hate speech or ideas you don't like. And that's what's so ridiculous about this. And the whole of government and whole of media effort to censor, crush, and criminalize certain speech critical of Israel. It's insane.
And that's what's happening right now. I mean, we're about to get to it in terms of the House of Representatives' passage of this anti-Semitism law. I mean, this is one of the biggest infringes upon the First Amendment since World War I. If you go back and you look at some of the anti-war acts that were imposed at that time on Americans who were trying to dissent from the war machine of that time about 100 years ago. So this is an extraordinary moment. And it's not even for a war where American troops are dying. Isn't that a little interesting? In terms of the war powers willing to basically insert and totalitarianize our democracy on behalf of a foreign power which is prosecuting a war. Similarly, Krystal, I think it's very important. I realize we haven't even had a chance to react to some of the things going on at Columbia, and I think people can say, I'm not like a pro-Kefia person or any of this, but I did a lot of research, and I have to be honest. So back when we looked previously at Hamilton Hall and the occupation, I said, I think it crosses the line because in property damage, vandalism, and trespassing. However, I do think, and again, and this is kind of where the discourse breaks apart. People are like, well, what would you expect? And I don't have any problem with arresting those individuals, but we have to come back to some of the original response to January 6th. So immediately in the aftermath of January 6th, Krystal, you and I were sitting here in our studio, I'll never forget, not here, but over at the Hill, and I'll never forget, having to go through Baghdad-like checkpoints, to get to our office, and a full federalization. And so, again, we were talking there about, okay, so the people should be prosecuted, certainly, right? People who entered the Capitol unlawfully. But does it mean that we should be prosecuting them as domestic terrorists? Does it mean that we should have spent $500 million, locking down our entire Capitol, deploying the National Guard, trying to institute a Patriot Act 2.0? And that's where I would really urge people where, even if you are skeptical or even outright oppositional to some of these protesters, I would urge proportionality in a response. And watching 1,000 NYPD police officers basically walk into Columbia is one of the most insane things I've ever seen. Again, we can arrest people and we can have this situation handled in a proportional manner relative to the crime that is being committed. Another thing is, and I'll be honest, I didn't actually know this, is I went back and did some research. So back in 1985, I talked previously about how protesters had occupied Hamilton Hall. Previously, protesters actually occupied Hamilton Hall for 3 weeks in 1985. And actually, it led to a Columbia University vote of divestment from apartheid South Africa at the time. So I have to be real. I have a lot more sympathy now for the people who did this because the university itself has a long history of both, allowing these types of things to happen, and also even following through with their demands. I don't even necessarily agree with the fact that you should be able to trespass on a hall and then your university 3 weeks later is gonna, bow to your demands, but you did it already in the past. So not only that, based upon all of their recruiting materials, they have consistently said Columbia is a seat of social justice action. They brag about the Hamilton Hall occupation of 1968 and 1985. They talk specifically about how their student body is like highly socially engaged. So it is very clear here that we are acting in a different manner as opposed to Israel. So I think then that, and I want people to hear this from somebody like me who's not necessarily the most sympathetic person. I want them to understand that, look, 1,000 people coming in to a private university under these pretexts and basically, occupying this campus whenever you have a long history of allowing such behavior in the past and bragging about it, that is very, very different, this time around. So we can have law and order and we can have proportionality, and we can also understand, I think, where there's a clear exception being made now here in the case of Israel. And in that, I have to object as an American citizen for what's happening.
Amen to all of that. And I mean, listen, just ask yourself, right? Like I said before, what is the normal response to a broken window and trespassing? Is it 1,000 police in riot gear? I'm pretty sure there's some other criminal activities happening in New York City where those cops might be useful. The smearing of these students as actual terrorists by the NYPD, by, Morning Joe. It's so... I really am losing my mind over this because we're about to get into what happened at UCLA as well. In terms of a protest movement, we can debate tactics. We've debated tactics even within the movement. There's debates about what tactics work and what's going to win people over and what's not going to be effective, et cetera. That's all fine and good. But in terms of a protest movement, which is massive in scale and size and nationwide, et cetera, they've been about as perfect as you could get. There have been so few instances of even property damage that it's actually incredible when you have this many human beings, some of whom are going to be a little out there. That doesn't undermine the justice of their cause in this particular instance, but you're going to have radicals, you're going to have weirdos, you're going to have that's human beings, okay? The fact that you've had so few instances that are even colorably violent is actually astonishing. And when you look at what happened at UCLA, the one instance where we had genuine violence, it is now very clear that it was nearly, if not entirely, one-sided. Pro-Israel counter-protesters coming in, shooting fireworks at them, busting down their encampment, assaulting them for hours with the police nowhere to be seen. So we're going to talk about student safety. You had dozens of anti-war protesters, some of whom may well have been Jewish, since this is the concern of the day, which, listen, I think all people, including Jewish people, should be safe. You had dozens of students sent to the hospital. Where's the media concern about those students' safety? Clearly, this risk to student safety has been in the crackdown and has been from these counter-protesters who, again, were allowed to assault them and run wild for hours. Where were the riot cops then in their gear with their heavy artillery to protect students when they actually were needed? They were nowhere to be found. And the UCLA, rent-a-cop security guards or whatever they had, they retreated and hid in a building. And were such cowards, they locked out the student journalists who had been given agreement that they could retreat into that building if their safety was under threat. And by the way, their safety was under threat. 4 of them were assaulted, according to the LA Times this morning, were assaulted by those pro-Israel counter-protesters. Where's the media outrage about that? Where's the concern about Jewish student safety, about any of that? Instead, you get this completely insane commentary from Dana Bash. Is she Dana or Dana?
We'll go with both.
Whoever, Dana Bash, who is supposedly, first of all, she's a congressional person, but she's not foreign affairs. She's not opinion. And yet she had the most insane take on this whole situation. I can scarcely even believe it. Take a listen to what this lady had to say.
Many of these protests started peacefully with legitimate questions about the war. But in many cases, they lost the plot. They're calling for a ceasefire. Well, there was a ceasefire on October 6th, the day before Hamas terrorists brutally murdered more than 1,000 people inside Israel and took hundreds more as hostages, making Jewish students feel unsafe at their own schools is unacceptable, and it is happening way too much right now.
I'm a UCLA student. I deserve to go here. We pay tuition. This is our school, and they're not letting me walk in. My class is over there. I want to use that entrance. Why can't they go? Will you let me go in? This could be over in a second. Just let me and my friends go in.
Again, what you just saw is 2024 in Los Angeles, harkening back to the 1930s in Europe, and I do not say that lightly. The fear among Jews in this country is palpable right now.
So, one video of someone claiming, which how many of these friggin' hoaxes have we seen at this point, that they're being blocked from going to class? And it's 1930s in Europe. It's equivalent to the Holocaust and millions of Jews being murdered on an industrial scale. This is so completely insane, especially, Saagar, given the fact that we know the bulk of the violence has been perpetrated against the anti-war protesters.
And then this is, look, I believe very strongly in equal application of the law. And I think that those protesters, who were it took 4 hours for the LAPD to come in. I think it's outrageous. It's very clearly that they just didn't feel like getting involved. Their excuse was that, that they didn't have enough troops or something like that, which I just simply don't believe, honestly, because they had campus security there as well. The other thing is, time for a little history lesson there. Dana, I believe it is Dana, by the way, I just looked it up. So for the 1930s Germany, do people really want to know what happened? There were thousands of actual street brawls in the street between the Nazis, between the center-right parties, the socialists, the communists. I mean, it was an absolute bloodbath. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were killed in street violence. There wasn't actually state violence necessarily. And in fact, the vacuum of power and all of that at the time, the chaos, is eventually what led to some of the rise of the Nazi Party. And that's exactly why so many of our brain-dead comparisons to the 1930s are frankly insulting, to people who lived through the period of Weimar Germany.
Absolutely.
And saw what happened at that time of violence perpetrated against Jews. I mean, every once in a while, I'll see somebody, for example, I said, I think it crosses the line to break into Hamilton Hall. And then I go online and people are like, this is Kristallnacht because there's some broken glass. And I'm like, again, okay. It is deeply insulting to the survivors of Kristallnacht to compare the occupation and the breaking in of Hamilton Hall to what happened in 1930s Germany. But this isn't been a consistent
it's like a form
problem.
of Holocaust denial, honestly.
It's
equate
outrageous.
These acts as being anything like the acts that led up to that.
Of course. I mean, it's be like saying that any time that you detain somebody that they're like slaves, or, any time that you have, even if you have, it's like comparing affirmative action to Jim Crow or something, right? You could say it is a policy like Jim Crow or like a policy that has the echoes of something. But even then, I think it's outrageous and frankly insulting. So here again, everybody calm down. I even pulled the numbers and went back. Hamilton Hall this time around was roughly half the number, actually less than half of the number of people who were arrested in 1968. There were over 700 people who were arrested.
And they occupied a lot of other buildings.
They occupied quite a lot of other buildings. There was actually a shitload more violence than also at the time. And that's part of why I'm just like, look, guys, everybody just take a chill pill. It is not 1930s Germany. We've gotten through 10 times worse in our country, not even, that long ago. Everybody's fine. And yet for some reason, everything is just getting ratcheted up where these, a CNN anchor who, let's be honest, this lady probably has personal security or something like that, multi-millionaire, longtime denizen of Washington. You're not unsafe. Your kids aren't unsafe. Everybody's fine. If you are unsafe, it's because there's a shitload of crime here in D.C. 4 people got shot yesterday here in our city. I don't hear them complaining about that. That's not 1930s Germany.
It's not because of protesters at GWU
It's not
or
because of protesters
bullshit.
at GW. Exactly, right? That's the big problem that we have.
I would love to take a chill pill, Saagar, because I'm losing my mind over this.
Well, over the media reaction. I'm saying you're not saying I am physically unsafe now at this moment. And that's what I'm talking about.
No, I know. I just, I can't believe what a bunch of liars these people are. I can't believe how fake this all is. I can't believe how manufactured it is. That now you have, we just showed you a little slice of the completely insane media reaction. Now college, they're Nazis, they're terrorists, they're Hamas. They deserve, the equivalent to 1930s Germany. When, again, the one violent protest, it was entirely because and caused by and perpetrated by pro-Israel protesters assaulting anti-war protesters. And it is so clear what the game is. It's so clear what the game is. Look at our poll, look at any polling out there. These college kids and other members of this protest movement have won the debate. The numbers in favor of a ceasefire are overwhelming. Among people who voted for Joe Biden, the numbers are even more overwhelming. And so to distract from the clear righteousness of their cause, which, by the way, all of these people 10 years from now will be pretending that they were on their side, or they'll be covering their ass about why it was understandable at the time that they compared them to Nazis and all this crap. Okay? It's all to distract from what the kids are actually protesting about and the clear justice of their cause when they say, I don't want my tax dollars going to bomb babies. I also think it's important, and Saagar brought this up a number of times in other segments as well, to keep in mind their specific asks and to make the comparison. So at Brown University, they had protests, they had an encampment, and the administration met with them and said, you know what, we're not going to commit to divesting, which is the specific ask from like Lockheed Martin or whoever they invest in. But we are going to schedule a vote, and it's going to be taken up, and we're taking your concerns seriously. And guess what? They said the protest. Okay, we're going to disband the encampment. It was all fine.
It also then, if they rejected that, then they would look a lot worse. If they were like, okay, we'll have a vote, and you can. What Brown agreed to, like you said, is not just a vote, but they said that you can come and you can present your case to the Board of Governors, which I think I'm actually totally fine with, because that means that the Board of Governors will ultimately make an independent decision.
It also gets to, some of the critique that you have sometimes of these institutions, which is like, why are your investments so dear to you? Like your particular investments.
Oh, that I can answer.
Right, I know, exactly. Well, and we see too, Robert Kraft and these other large donors in the way they're willing to say, hey, we're not going to play ball if you deal with these, if you don't crack down on these protesters. So then that's how you end up in this utterly absurd situation. Just so you know, too, Washington Post had a great graphic of the way that these protests have spread like wildfire since that initial Columbia University crackdown, which you'll recall, President of Columbia University gets summoned to Capitol Hill to talk about anti-Semitism on campus. And basically, she pledges to, quote unquote, do more. And the very next day, the cops are brought in and, there's a massive crackdown. And that has sparked a huge uptick in terms of the number of these protests across college campuses, and kids are getting arrested too, coast to coast in, universities, small schools. Like I said before, the Ivy League and the elite institutions get a lot of the attention Columbia does because they're in New York City. But any manner and variety, small, large, more working class, more upscale of schools across the country now are seeing these protest movements and attendant crackdowns and arrests. Let's take a look at these graphics that the Washington Post pulled together. So you can see there on the left, they have the protests, the number of protests, the size of the protests of the week beginning April 10th. Then you have the crackdown at Columbia. That was on April 23rd. You can see how they grew. And then after that, you can see how it really just explodes. And that's when you're talking about, any number of schools, coast to coast, types of schools, elite, normal state institutions, and everything in between. So if your goal was to actually diminish the energy of this protest movement, congratulations, you've done exactly the opposite. And if you think these students are gonna stop now because of what they've seen, I've got another thing coming for you.
All right.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.